I mean, so what's kind of particularly interesting to me to have this conversation is that, thinking about what was the inspiration for bioRxiv is that sort of one of the people who, I mean, obviously we were aware of arXiv, for a long time, and there'd been conversations that had been happening within the biomedical community for years and years and years about whether or not this could work in biology. And always there had always been these kind of narratives that physicists were different. What arXiv was doing with physics and mathematics was completely different, because these were completely different people. It was a completely different culture, and it would never work in biology. And that kind of conversation had been going on for years. But what was very interesting about, sort of 8 years ago, was we began to see indications that this wasn't the case. I mean, I had seen people like Leonid putting papers on arXiv, Graham Coop, Joe Pickrell, and various others in the population genetics community were talking about this. And I spoke to a few people in that area, and at Cold Spring Harbor, we thought, well, really the time is right for this. And when you spoke to people who were biologists who used to be physicists or mathematicians, they said, this is nonsense, exactly the same. There's no fundamental difference in culture. This can totally work in biology. So I think that was the inspiration. And we spoke to Paul Ginsberg, obviously the founder of arXiv, and people like Leonid in the community. I think, Leonid, you probably remember a meeting at Cold Spring Harbor when we were all sat round at a lunch table and essentially said, do we think this can work? And I think you said yes. And basically that was it. It was one lunchtime meeting in the middle of the Biology of Genomes annual meeting at Cold Spring Harbor, where we basically said, let's do this. I mean, do you remember that meeting, Leonid?
Yeah, I do. And I think, I mean, it's not an accident that it was at the Biology of Genomes meeting, because I think the population genetics, genomics, computational biology communities, I mean, had a pretty strong culture of data sharing around the Genome Project, and even a culture of sending papers around to each other, informally before they were submitted or published. In the same way that, I mean, I still just barely remember from my own education in physics that there was a physical preprint culture in physics that predates arXiv, and that served as the origin of arXiv, when folks like Paul figured out that this can now be done much more efficiently and much more inclusively, instead of just kind of the network of people who knew each other sharing papers before publication. And I think many of us in the genomics, population genetics, computational bio world came from math or physics or other fields where this was just a totally culturally accepted common practice. And we saw no reason why, at least within that community, it wouldn't get rapidly adopted. And then we figured, just as was the case in the more quantitative fields, there would be subfields that would lead, but eventually other subfields would follow. And I think there is a famous quote from Paul that no community that started using no subfield that started using preprints has ever gone back, right? So once you try it, everybody realizes how valuable this is.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That the sort of subdisciplines role in this. I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me at Cold Spring Harbor was there were former physicists and mathematicians on our faculty, and I spoke to two people in particular, Justin Kinney and Mickey Atwell, who said things like, when they kind of came from physics into biology, the first thing that they asked their colleagues was, where's the arXiv for biology? And the answer was, there isn't one. And they were like, well, you guys are crazy. Why isn't there one? There should be one. And, somebody should build one. And so we, obviously those people came on board with their experience of arXiv. And, you mentioned Paul's quote about no discipline that's started has ever stopped. Another thing that seems to be really interesting in arXiv is the way you've got these waves of adoption in different disciplines that really started with the high energy physicists, and then the condensed matter physicists, and the other ones came along. And I feel like we've seen exactly the same the same thing in biology, and you guys were first. It was the population geneticists, the genomics people, and so the quote I always come up with is that genomics is the high energy physics of biology, and then you get to a point sort of interestingly like 2 or 3 years later, and then I guess this is where you come in, Prachee, is somebody who's a cell biologist, and you say, well, what's this thing that's going on, and why aren't we part of it?
I mean, it was ridiculous. My introduction to bioRxiv was later. It wasn't until 2016 when ASAP Bio had its first meeting, and I tell the story that I watched that meeting from my couch at home because it was broadcast, and I was at the time it felt like a very revolutionary idea, but it's because I hadn't quite connected the dots. My husband was a mathematics PhD, and he had already posted in the arXiv, years before. And, I knew he had done that, and it made so much sense. He was in pure math. And so, it would take years for things to make its way through peer review. It made literally no sense to not disseminate the work early. If you wanted anyone to see it, you had to put it in the arXiv, because it could take literally, I think his paper was in peer review for like 18 months or 2 years or some ridiculous number. And so it was just such common practice. And he often, tells me that he finds it ridiculous that I'm putting so much energy into sort of, spreading the word about this, because it's so obvious to him. It's just, why isn't it obvious to all of you? It's obvious to me. And, so when I, saw that meeting and heard the case, and it really helped to know that, that arXiv had such a long, successful history, right? That this wasn't just, I think for a lot of people in the community, in the biology community, it was really helpful to see that this is not just, some pie in the sky idea. It's been going on for decades. We just finally caught up with the fact that the internet exists, that we can actually do something about it. And so it was just so self-evidently a good idea. I think that's what I couldn't shake, is that when you heard, wait a second, you can just take your work and make it available, because literally everything we need is there in order to be able to do that. And it was only 1 year after I had started my own lab, and it was the first time I had a chance to make my own decisions about how we share our work and where we publish, and it just made so much sense. And I couldn't think of anything else to do. You talk about how you could never go back. Once I heard the idea, I couldn't go back. And then it was just sort of waiting, like, oh, I can't wait to post that first preprint, because, the idea, once I knew it was a possibility, there was no other option. Yeah,
and I guess I had a couple of experiences of, I think both in 2012 or around then, right, shortly before we started having the conversations about bioRxiv, that are sort of the origin story. And the first one is, if you remember, there was this whole arsenic life affair where this group published a paper claiming that this bacterium could use arsenic instead of phosphorus. And there's a scientist at the University of British Columbia, Rosie Redfield, who was doing a lot of blogging about the story and talking about how it's impossible. And then she finally got the strain from the group that published it. And she said, okay, I'm happy to grow this, but I need a collaborator to actually look at what's going on, with its metabolism, etc. And I had a collaborator, and I was very interested in this whole thing. So I reached out to her, and I said, we can do this together. And she was like, that sounds great, as long as we do everything in the open and we, post everything. And she would blog about it along the way. And then as soon as the manuscript was ready, we posted to arXiv. And it was sort of straining it, because the only thing on arXiv was quantitative biology, and this was really a pretty experimental paper, but we did it anyway. And shortly after that, we had a paper that we were super excited about from my lab in quantitative genetics, but again, it was like mostly an experimental paper that was slowly bending its way through peer review. Slowly, even for that process, in the case of that particular paper. And
both I and the lead author had been talking about it at meetings for a year, and it sort of existed in this weird like quantum superposition where everybody who happened to hear one of us give a seminar or attended one of a small number of meetings, knew the work, and for everybody else, it didn't exist. And so I was like, hey, arXiv exists and it doesn't exactly fit this to a T, but sure, there's quantitative stuff in there and it's biology, so let's pop it on there. And as soon as we did, the experience of doing that was so good and the feedback was so good and being able to point everybody in the field to the paper, that we just started doing it for everything basically coming out of the lab. And I think within a year of that, bioRxiv launched, so we could find a home that was more specifically designed to accommodate it. So that's kind of where it all started for us.
Well, it's interesting to me that Arsenic, that was one of the very kind of first sort of really obvious reproducibility papers that I remember looking at. And I think, it's no coincidence to me that when we had those original discussions about what bioRxiv would look like, one of the things that we all talked about was there could be a huge advantage to the fact that there wasn't any sort of specific selection for novelty, and there were these papers that people found it hard to find homes for. And we thought, well, at least, if they can put it on a preprint server, on arXiv or bioRxiv, then at least it takes that worry away. And so we actually went on to create that was the source of saying, well, most papers on bioRxiv are going to be new results, but we'll have this contradictory and confirmatory results categories to really incentivize people to put up work like that and make it clear that there's no discrimination based on novelty or a challenge to something of that form.
Yeah, the author control is so key. I feel like that is still one of the main features that is so powerful, right? It's the people who know the work best can make sure that it sees the light of day when they're ready for people to see it. And that is just so compelling that, that to not have to have a small number of gatekeepers decide when something becomes public. And it's just such an important feature. But it does feel like there is this sort of like gateway thing that happens, that once you post a preprint, it's just, it becomes, and that experience is so formative in thinking about how you do science in the future. For us, our first preprint, probably months after I had heard about bioRxiv, we had put together this paper. And I think the impetus for doing that timing is that I had proposed a session at a conference at the American Society for Cell Biology meeting to talk about preprints, because I was so excited about the idea. I'm like, everyone should hear about this. Why don't we talk about it at the cell biology meeting? That's probably where I met you, Richard, for the first time. Was that at that meeting? But spurred by that, I was really motivated to post that first preprint before we went to that meeting and told everyone about it, so that I could actually have had the experience. And so, what we posted, that preprint, went to the meeting and then did what we do at conferences, which is give talks and give posters. But this time we had a URL, we had a DOI to, send people to, where they could actually, instead of having things sort of, flash before their eyes, in a few minutes during the talk, or just, for a few minutes at a poster, they could actually sit with it and read it. And that gave them the ability to give us more useful feedback. And so, everyone who came to our posters, we sent them to the preprint, and they started, telling us, like, hey, asking us better questions, deeper questions. And then we could sort of revise everything on the basis of, like 15 people all asked us the same thing, something that's sort of hard to do if you just sort of like put it out there and hope the universe sees it. But when, at the meeting, everyone was coming to the posters. So those were people who were already interested in the work. They've already self-selected to want to see it. And so, they would give us this feedback. We revised it, and we made a first revision before we ever sent it to the journal. And I couldn't make up the story, but it was the first and only paper I've ever had that got accepted without revision, and it's because it had already been peer reviewed, because we had sent it out and we had asked the people in the community who cared about it most, who were really interested in the work, to give us feedback on it. And that, that was my very first experience with a preprint. That's it. It was done. I mean, we're never doing anything over again. That's not that.
I mean, it's interesting to me. You mentioned meetings, because I'm sure, Leonid, we have both been out at sort of several American Society of Human Genetics meetings on biology of genomes, and one of the things that I remember sort of seeing that made me think this is really taking off in genetics was going to biology of genomes, and then and seeing slides with bioRxiv on, and then going to an ASHG meeting. And I was in one of those early, sort of before the proper meeting starts, there's a special interest group type session. And, there were 5 talks, and every single one had like this sort of bioRxiv DOI. And it was kind of really, it was amazing to me how quickly this fraction of the genetics community were just like immediately like, we should do this thing the physicists have been doing for ages is, and you made the point, Prachee, it's self-evident. And I think that's what's been so kind of interesting to me, is conversations with people, trying to persuade them about that, and just talking to people. You get to this point where people just kind of go, oh yeah, I mean, it would be stupid to do it any other way. And I mean, I don't know if I didn't know what your experience with meetings, Leonid, was, but that's what I remember so vividly, was biology of genomes, and just being in a session and being like, everyone's talking about a paper that's up as a preprint.
Yeah, and I mean, aside from kind of these general benefits of openness and author control and all of that stuff that we've been talking about, and just kind of how natural and fun this way of sharing your work is, I mean, there are some real practical benefits kind of along the lines of what Prachee started talking about. Like at least once we were saved from a pretty major, goof in a paper where we had thought, there was a thorny statistical issue with something we were trying to do. And we tried to think it through very carefully. We submitted the paper and we posted the preprint at the same time, which is usually what we do. And it went through pretty thorough review, and none of the reviewers picked up on, this fairly subtle error, but somebody who read the preprint did and contacted us, and we kind of rethought that whole section of the paper. And revised it and told the journal, hey, look, none of, the formal review didn't pick up on this, but the informal review did. So we're making this fairly substantial change because we want to get this, right. So I think just, having 2 or 3 pairs of eyes on something, even after you do it and you have your trusted, readers do it, having everybody be able to look at it, really vets the work, I think, much more thoroughly than traditional peer review does. And then, of course, I think the last year and change has made it really evident that there are circumstances under which speed is genuinely a matter of life and death, right? And if all the COVID papers, not that there weren't issues along the way, but if everybody had to wait until all of those papers were peer reviewed and published, like the pandemic would be over before anybody could learn the lessons of any of the studies anybody was doing, right? I mean,
yeah. But even in those cases, right? So even with the issues, it feels like, there's not going to be coverage on all of the different aspects of a paper from those handful of peer reviewers. And it's the most important in those cases where you really do want people with expertise who are not necessarily going to get tapped for peer review. You want everyone to see it, the more important it is. And I feel that way all the time from the reviewer perspective. Is if I get asked to review a paper, sometimes it's like, this is a really important paper and I only have expertise to cover some fraction of it. And certainly, hopefully the editor has picked other reviewers that cover other aspects of it. But all the time I think, why isn't this a preprint? Why isn't everybody weighing in on this instead of, us handful of, random people, so it feels like from both sides, it just makes so much more sense for more eyes to see it and to really, have everyone weigh in.
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, it's interesting you talked about that, the goofs one makes. And I don't know what you, Leonid, you should answer this question since you were the person who actually rebutted the finding. But one of the things that I've said to people in sort of debates around preprints is that if the Arsenic Life, the original paper, had been posted as a preprint, it would never have been published in Science, is my contention. I don't know. I mean,
right, and that was one of the, so because the process is so closed, right? It's rare that we see peer reviews. In that case, we did. I think I don't remember the whole history, but part of it was then Vergano, a science reporter, got them through a Freedom of Information Act request because some of the authors worked for the U.S. government, right? And you could see in that case that there were 3 reviews, 2 of which were completely superficial, and 1 which had spotted basically all the problems. And the authors managed to kind of argue their way out of it. And I don't think it ever, because of like the excitement of the finding or whatever, I don't think it ever went back to that reviewer. But yeah, I think the community would have torn it to shreds from every aspect: chemistry, microbiology, evolutionary biology. There were so many problems, right? And there are other. I think it was one of the. I'm trying to remember. There was some other major problem like that. That again, like when the reviews were leaked, there was one reviewer who had, totally pointed out what the issues were going to be, and through some combination of authorial, rhetoric and editorial eagerness, they were not addressed. And in the end, they were spot on. But when you have a preprint, when those types of things happen publicly, and when you don't have one person, but you have everybody in that field of expertise saying this is fatally flawed, right? Or an absolutely essential control is missing, or whatever. It's a different story.
I mean, it really makes a good case for public review, right? To just have those comments posted, right? Because there's a lot of, even people who are fans of preprints still don't totally understand. They say, well, why can't I just privately send my comments? And it just really makes the case that sometimes, I mean, especially for the readers, and especially if it's work that's important to a broad audience, it really helps to have everyone be able to see it. Now, it doesn't mean that all of the comments are necessarily going to be, right on target, but to have the public conversation, to be able to have even authors come back and say, I disagree with this, but to have it be open is just so important. And I feel like that case is sometimes lost, even with people who are big fans of preprints, still just sort of don't understand why they can't sort of like backdoor email someone and just have that conversation be private. But there's still so many benefits to not having it be that way.
Right. Yeah. And I think, in general, like what's often happened with the discussion around preprints and critiques of papers on blogs and Twitter and all of this stuff is what I learned is that biologists are very polite compared to physicists. And in physics, there has always been a very robust culture of criticism, right? If somebody posts a preprint on arXiv and it's flawed, every senior person in that field will very publicly point out that it's flawed, right? And so a lot of stuff just never sees light of day, or people have an incentive not to put up bad work. And if they do, there is a reputational cost, and everybody knows what's bad, right? Whereas there is sort of expectation in biology that we don't do that, culturally. As certainly in some fields. And I think it's actually an incredibly valuable function, because ultimately at the end of the day, the science has to be right. And, it's not personal, but the work has to stand up.
Yeah. Well,
you make a very good point. Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's interesting bringing that up, because I know one of the things, I don't know if you saw it, but Paul Ginsburg wrote a great sort of fact on the sort of frequently asked questions of arXiv by biologists. And I always point people to that, because there's this question where people say, oh, does this mean that, you're going to get all sorts of garbage on the server and people are going to try and put up shoddy work? And, Paul makes the great point that, your reputation is the only thing that you've got in academia. It's so important. And so, you may get some stuff, but, anybody who's serious, anybody who really wants to advance and be part of academic culture is not going to put stuff up like that, because the last thing that you want is to get this rep for being, the individual who puts out shoddy work, because that kind of reputation, we all know it sticks to you. And yeah, then sorry.
And I feel like that criticism, I was just going to say, I feel like that criticism though is often by people who haven't posted one, because I think all it takes is just to pull the trigger and say, I'm going to post one. And then you get struck with the fear of, oh my goodness, everyone's going to see this. And then you sort of like double, triple, quadruple check it. I mean, you feel the pressure of, your reputation being, publicly put out there when you post a preprint. And so I think that, the people who sort of have that criticism, like, oh, it's just going to be this, fire hose of poor quality work because it's not, not yet peer reviewed. And it's just the opposite of that. I mean, it feels like exactly the opposite of that.
And it's not like we've always done a fantastic job of identifying those things anyway. I mean, there was a very amusing story about a year and a half ago. Fortunately, I can't remember the name of the journal or the journal editor, but somebody wrote an editorial in a clinical journal saying, that this approach of arXiv and bioRxiv was a bad idea because you get these crummy papers. And he pointed to this paper and he said, this is an example of the kind of crummy work that appears on a preprint server. And then finally, I kind of looked at it, and then I actually saw on Twitter, somebody made the point, I can't remember their words, they said something like, the argument is not so subtly undermined by the fact that by the time the editorial was published, the article on the preprint server had appeared in a journal unchanged. So whatever flaws it were may well have been there, but they certainly weren't being removed by the traditional system. And
right, and it probably came out in the same journal that printed the editorial.
That's right. It's true.
It is interesting because so Eleanor was talking early on about medRxiv, and you both mentioned COVID-19, and that was obviously the other kind of interesting experiment for us, in that we were obviously inspired by arXiv to launch bioRxiv, but we were very, very careful at the beginning, and we had sort of strict rules about no clinical studies, no clinical trials, because we thought maybe this is a step too far, we need to think about it. But then it was interesting, as we'd been watching the physicists and the mathematicians, then the clinicians had been watching us in biology. And I saw an editorial, I can't remember which way around it was, but Eric Topol wrote an editorial in the New York Times, and I called him up, or the other way around, I can't remember the sequence of events, but pretty soon it was like having a conversation with two very sort of serious clinicians saying this absolutely should be happening in biology, in medicine, just as it's happening in biology and physics and math. And so obviously, 2 or 3 years later, then we went on to launch medRxiv with one of those people, Harlan Krumholtz, who'd written the editorial with Eric. And that's another kind of example of the how useful a process was, as you say, Leonid, because boy, did that happen at the right time because of COVID-19, and it was amazing to see, again, back to what you said initially, Prachee, about the self-evidence of this. medRxiv suddenly, I think it was January 16th, we got a paper from China describing details of COVID-19, and then there was a deluge. It wasn't, this was a kind of like non-profit academic endeavor. We hadn't done any marketing. We'd certainly done no marketing in China. And suddenly we were getting tens of papers every day from China on epidemiology of COVID-19. We had things like the structure of spike. And then, this thing which I wouldn't have imagined 3 years before, but, the biggest clinical trials of treatments for COVID-19 coming out in medRxiv saying, treat people with dexamethasone, it works. Don't treat people with hydroxychloroquine, it doesn't work. Which, and the individuals who did that study are to be congratulated for, because it really was pretty amazing, that big British study. But again, to their credit, they got the information out very, very quickly. as a preprint. And as you said, Leonid, that that when lives are at stake, it really does make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, it's exactly that. It's just all of the sort of, there's always a flip side of the coin. All of the things that people are concerned about, it's just even more important that those things are open, public, fast, and available to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points, I think it was Steve Quake from the BioHub in San Francisco has this sort of great back of envelope calculation. This is something that Leon will understand the math far better than I do. But I mean, essentially, he talks about the notion that each time somebody posts a preprint, they're saving a year. But if you think of how discoveries work, you essentially get the equivalent of a geometric effect, and science itself will move faster. And I think that was the thing that always underlay our thinking about this, is that this really can make stuff happen faster. And with COVID-19, I was contacted by an author who said, we put our paper on bioRxiv. We've sent out the plasmids to 400 people. There's 40 clinical trials starting already. And again, you just think that the speed, taking advantage of the web was what made that happen.
It's staggering. It's staggering to think of that. And it feels like every preprint is that example, because as soon as you post it and you start to talk to people about it, and I think we understand that, right? We've understood this for a long time. If you tell people, oh, well, why don't you post your work as a preprint? And they said, oh, well, that, I can't possibly do this early before peer review. But if you ask them, would you share it at a conference? Would you talk to people about it? The reasons for sharing it at a conference are exactly the same. They already know that they want to make those collaborations. They want to get early feedback. They want to have people who have reagents that they could use and be able to, share them back. They want all of the same benefits that you would get, only it's just limited to that small number of people in those small rooms. Whereas this is just, a much broader example of exactly that. So, it's just every single time you share anything early, it's immediately evident. You make more connections, and, just even from the perspective of things that people worry about on academic careers, and in just, being able to, just meet more people and, give more talks and be able to have that discussion openly is just, it's something that we've always valued. It's just in a different form, in a more useful form, it seems like.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a conversation I've had any number of times with trainees in the lab, because obviously it's like their career is on the line, and they have on occasion had hesitations about posting stuff or the timing of posting or whatever. And I was like, okay, let me make the case. And the ultimate decision is up to you. And in pretty much without exception, they've all chosen to preprint. And then they realized, oh, I can apply for this job even though my paper isn't published, because everybody can see the preprint, they can read it, and it counts, as opposed to, manuscript in preparation or submit it, right? And
Right.
you have no idea what that actually means. So it does accelerate. I mean, it doesn't slow down careers, it accelerates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that is something that it's impossible. The nice thing is that there is this small element of a fear of missing out, right? And it's the same thing that you talked about, Richard, about just going to a meeting and seeing every single talk. Someone's got a preprint up, and then all of a sudden it starts to feel like everyone's doing this great thing, and then it's the same thing that the students and are up against, right? Is that when everyone else they're competing with for those jobs, they have those preprints out, and it's you could choose to sit on it, or you could choose to get credit for that, and I mean, I think the same thing goes for funding and all of those things, is you can choose to wait and wait for credit for that or not.
And how important, I don't know how often you've experienced this, Leonid, how important is that as the timing? Prachee, you mentioned it puts the author in control, but one of the main thing it puts the author in control of is the timing of the dissemination of information. And so, it's the priority stamp. It's like, I did this on this day, and at any point in the future, however long the peer review takes, big kind of error bars on that, but at least that this was the thing that you could have you controlled. I mean, is that something that's been important to you?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's sort of people worry about scooping, and I'm like, how can people scoop you if you made it public and everybody knows, right? If somebody then, publishes a paper 3 months later, it's clear and a matter of record that you did it first. And fairly quickly the fields start to think that way, and it's the posting of the preprint that becomes the priority stamp and not publication. So yeah, I think aside from, and I mean, it gives you the control. As Prachee said, you can put it up before a meeting, you can put it up before a grant goes in, you can put it up when your job application needs to be in, for a faculty position as a postdoc, even if, the journal will still be a couple of months away. So yeah, I think all of those things, but it obviously and publicly establishes priority.
And I mean, one thing that also does that I'm very, very keen on is because you've got the dissemination out of the way, then you've immediately decoupled the evaluation process from it. And I think what's kind of really interesting now is thinking about what does that mean? I mean, one of the things that I've been saying for a long time is that the way we do peer review up until recently, for the past few decades, is basically pretty standardized. Whatever subject it is, you send it to 3 people and you beg them to give you reports in a couple of weeks' time, and they don't, and you hassle them, and then you get the reports in, and you reject some fraction of them, and you tell the authors to do more work, and that's a slow step. But I mean, population genetics, cell biology, synthetic biology, these are all different subjects with different sort of things going on. One of the things that preprints have definitely done is stimulate experiments in peer review. And you were talking about the kind of public discussion. Perhaps one of the things that, I mean, Eli, for example, is now posting all their peer reviews, as is EMBO, and they're beginning to do this before the actual decision is taken on the manuscript. So what do you think that what's this going to create downstream? I mean, Prachee, what do you think is going to happen in 30 years time? I think was one of the questions. What does peer review look like as a consequence of this decoupling?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think that it's definitely exactly what you said, is that the decoupling actually, even if you sort of spread it apart in time. So one thing that I found is that the longer I go between when I post a preprint and when I submit it to the journal, the less and less I care about submitting it to the journal. It just becomes somewhat irrelevant. And that's sort of where I sort of see this heading, right? Is that as we build a more robust culture of public feedback, it's going to become less and less important that we are so married to the way that we do it now, right? And that, as we sort of, we scientists are putting that energy already into peer review, right? We're doing it, and it's just a question of how we do it and where do we put those energy and where do we put that energy and that effort, right? And so I just think that, as it becomes more commonplace, as more people start to post preprints, as more people start to see the benefits, it's going to become self-evident. So it does feel like it's a downhill battle, right? It feels like a downhill battle in which we, as more people start to do it and it becomes more commonplace, and we sort of build some cultural norms around giving that public feedback in the way that it does exist, like you said, Leonid, for physicists and in these other fields, it just becomes more commonplace to give that open and communication, that open feedback. And I think that as we start to do that, we will start to rely less. None of the pieces have changed. The scientists are still giving feedback the way scientists do. It's just, and it's true that the questions are, what's the incentive to do it if there's not some journal organizing it, and no one's harassing you by email every two minutes, but there are pieces to be figured out there. But I think that as we move forward, we will become more comfortable with posting, more comfortable with public feedback, and we will start to decouple it further and further in a way that the way that our system looks now is no longer really going to be relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree. And I think the only surprise maybe is how long it's taking for the traditional system to go away, right? Yeah. It's going away for sure. The days of like closed peer review by journals and papers serially moving from one journal to the next in terms of who wants to publish it, etc., with rounds of closed review at each point and duplication of effort and mistakes pointed out in earlier reviews for journal one that go uncorrected when that journal reviews it and gets sent with all those flaws and eventually published with all those flaws. That's all totally crazy, right? In the current age of internet and preprints and all of that stuff. So it's going away, and it's just the cultural inertia and maybe to some extent the lack of all the replacement mechanisms for that, which are being put together. But I think the future clearly has to look something like, I mean, I think on a, let's say 5 to 10 year time scale, hopefully it's faster than that. The authors control what they put up when, and then there is some, much more public and distributed evaluation process. And the role of journals becomes to highlight, things that they saw that A, looked interesting and within their sphere, and B, passed muster in this public realm. And if they also want to have either in-house or outsourced rounds of more private review, if they really want to, kick the tires on something, that's fine. And I think, one thing I've talked about for a long time around this, so basically the idea is overlay journals, right? The journals become a digest of interesting reviews, interesting preprints and why they're interesting, and we've vetted them and we think they're solid. And that doesn't have to be just the professional publishers, societies, journals, right? There can be, alongside all of that, there can be, Leonid's digest of genetics and Prachee's digest of cell biology, things that struck your fancy over the previous months that you thought were particularly interesting and in your view were solid based on your own reading and on your reading of the community opinion. And I think, if we're being asked to speculate 30 years out, who knows, right? Maybe we'll all be communicating all of this to each other continuously and telepathically. But I think the preprints are going to get further divorced from kind of the rigid article format of one-time publication of a big unit all the time. I think it's going to get even more rapid in terms of I've got this method or I made this cool observation, right? And then that, how that gets exactly packaged into a story or how it gets updated. But it's got to get, so, the preprints eliminate that months to years delay from when you have something that's in the form of a completed study and when anybody can actually read it. But there's also, months or years of interesting nuggets or methodological improvements or whatever that you make along the way from when they're ready to even be pre-printed in something like its current form. And so I don't know if this is going to be like open lab notebooks or what exactly it's going to look like, but I think more rapid and continuous exchange of information in smaller chunks.
Well, I'm certainly interested in the idea that the next phase of scientific publication technology is going to be telepathy. But so here's a kind of, a sort of a request for a prediction from you both. When you think of something like the Poincare conjecture, and there's that paper in arXiv, never went to a journal. It's funny when I think, we're having this conversation today, and yesterday evening, I think it was, we had the first complete genome sequence of a human was posted on bioRxiv. So, when do you think we're going to see a really big discovery that somebody's going to put on a preprint server in the biomedical sphere and say, that's it, I'm done, it's there?
It's already there. It's already there. I just think, history decides what really withstands the, test of time and becomes a very big discovery and a big finding, especially in the biological sciences. And so it could very well be that it's already there and it's just going to take us some years to uncover it.
Yeah, but I think in terms of people recognizing it at the time and the person posting it knows it's a big deal and I'm just not going to do anything beyond this. I think it's 5 to 10 years, right? And I hope it's sooner. And the only reason it's not there is the coupling with the evaluation and career structures and all of that stuff. Like, I mean, if I were to do something now that was entirely my own work, or that I, put together with another senior colleague or something like that, I do it today. I mean, it's just, when a lot of the work involves trainees and, more junior colleagues, who, and right now you still need that journal stamp of approval to make career progress. I think that's really the only thing that's holding us, that's holding us back at this point.
But the journals are also evolving. And I really liked your point about the curation and the way that we are doing curation, whether the journals do it or whether individuals do it. And we're already doing it. Every day I highlight a new preprint on Twitter with, what I thought was interesting to read and why I think it's something, sort of novel and worth reading. And I think that more and more people are doing this. And also it gives us an opportunity to uncover things that don't always get read. So, we're used to as using all of these different proxies for deciding what is of interest. And right now it is very much journal based, but, then, one thing that I hear all the time is that, oh, if you, in the absence of the journal, then people will just use the investigator or the institution or something like that. And so it really, I think that as we start to put, more people participate in sharing the work early in this way, it brings more, more of a global contribution to seeing, what other people think is interesting and important. And so we can really uncover other types of science that we, otherwise are biased against, and our systems are biased against. And so I think, that and journals are evolving, and as they may start to, and they already are. They want to be on the forefront and not get left behind in a shifting, publication landscape. And so I think that they are all, with progressive journals at the lead are trying to, find ways to stay relevant, right? By maybe doing those digests, pre-lights, for example, other, sort of journal-based initiatives to try and highlight different preprints. And there will be those ways in which these preprints will get sort of a different way of a stamp of approval.
Right. So I guess
it may matter to people. Yeah.
So I guess that, yeah, Richard, maybe I'd push back a little bit on the premise of the question, like just on bioRxiv and never submit it to a journal. I feel like that's the way it should be. The authors should play no role in the journal process. The author's job is to do the work, vet it, to their own satisfaction, and put it out there in public on the preprint server. And then the process of, evaluation, further vetting, dissemination, etc., should be played by somebody else. It's crazy that we waste all this time and energy dealing with all of that stuff. We've made the findings, we've put them up for public consumption, and now it's our job to go do more science, right, and not deal with the publication process. So I think that's where the job of the scientists and the authors should end. And then what process takes place after that, and whether it's a journal or some new form, right, or any number of a hybrid sort of set of things in some totally new ecosystem, right? We'll have to see.
And I think actually what's interesting is the importance of kind of new tools and new online cultures that will enable that. I mean, one of the long questions that has always gone on, I know Paul Ginsberg just talked about it, people have said, well, this thing was built in 1991, why do you still have journals? And of course, you've given some of those reasons, Leonid, but I mean, the other thing I think that happened was I think of like, the three of us are on Twitter and have scientific conversations on Twitter. There was no Twitter in 1991. I've sort of said in the past that I think a huge driver of bioRxiv success was Twitter and scientists being familiar of not using this necessarily to show what they had to breakfast, but to show what they've just done in the lab. And so I kind of think it's kind of interesting that we're beginning to see a lot of things that were always there in the promise of arXiv, but required these kind of like ancillary technologies, social media, etc., which those things have only emerged relatively recently, and so the potential for preprints will only really be realized as a consequence of the emergence of those things.
And it's very exciting because people are creative, right? And you get to see this collective conversation happen where people are coming up with these new ideas and incubating these ideas in different ways of evaluation and different ways of feedback and different ways of curation and all of those things. And that conversation is being had publicly in a way that all of us can participate and can move forward a lot faster. So I completely agree with you that it's sort of the confluence of multiple technologies in multiple different realms that are actually helping this along. And there's no time like the present. I think for all of us and for many people who are sort of thinking about these issues, this feels like a unique time. It feels like a sort of a special time where things really have a chance to change.
Yeah, and there's now a whole generation of biologists who've grown up with this being totally second nature, and I think they'll drive this to the next phase.
It's such an important point. I'll just say with one last thing, which is that I had that experience with a graduate student of mine where we had posted a preprint months ago and we had gotten the feedback and we'd done a revision and we sent it to the journal, and there was no stress. We've already there was just no anxiety about this at all. And I told her, I said, back in the day, we used to, not know what was coming back from the journal. It would be like this surprise. And she said, oh, that sounds horrible. And it was just, she's only known because she's only ever been in our lab, and this is the only way we've ever done it. And it was just truly beautiful. It was a beautiful moment.
It's going to be like that conversation you have with, like I had with sort of teenagers, and they say, and I say, when I was a teenager, there were no cell phones. And they're like, oh my God, I can't imagine what that was like, and so now you have young investigators and you say, when I was a young investigator, there were no preprints. So,
I think we're not that far off from that point. I think we're not that far off.
Well, we're right on the hour now.
One thing I would like to ask you, if you could just each of you introduce yourself, because we don't have the recording of that.
Okay. Do you want to go first? Then Leonid. I'm
looking.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm Prachee. Yeah. Who's going first? Okay. My name is Prachee Avasthi. I'm an associate professor of biochemistry and cell biology at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth College. I'm also a big fan of preprints, and as a member of the board of directors of ASAP Bio and its current president.
I'm Leonid Kruglyak. I'm the chair of the Human Genetics Department here at UCLA, and also one of the founding advisories to bioRxiv.
Okay, so I'm Richard Sever. I'm assistant director of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press at Cold Spring Harbor Lab, and I'm co-founder of bioRxiv and medRxiv.